Picture the Miami Boat Show. Engines lined up like stiff soldiers, Yamahas, Mercurys, Suzukis. All respectable, all familiar, but all similar. Then you stumble onto something towering, painted, glowing, and thundering with 627 horsepower. It didn't look like an outboard. It looked like a spaceship bolted to fiberglass. And here's the kicker. Without this experiment in excess, today's 600 horsepower V12s might never have been greenlit. Let's rewind to 2016. Picture yourself at the Miami International Boat Show, weaving through rows of center consoles, sport fishers, and outboard engines lined up like warriors on parade. You'd see plenty of familiar faces on the transoms. Yamaha's F350, Mercury's Verado 350s, maybe a Suzuki 300 here and there. These were the giants of their time, the engines that defined bragging rights at the dock. If your neighbor rolled up with twin Yamaha 350s, you knew he was making a statement. Triple Merc 350s, that guy wasn't just boating, he was flexing. That was the world as it was. And then you turned a corner and saw it. The 7 Marine 627. Suddenly, every other outboard on the dock looked like a toy. It towered above them, a hulking, gleaming mass of fiberglass and polished metal that seemed more at home on a spaceship than a boat. People stopped mid-step, frozen like they'd just seen a UFO land on the transom of a center console. Conversations died mid-sentence. One guy was overheard muttering, "That's not an engine, that's a rocket." And he wasn't wrong. What made it so shocking wasn't just the size. It was the number stamped proudly on the cowl. 627 horsepower. At a time when the competition was only creeping past 300, 7 Marine had more than doubled it. To put it in perspective, this was like showing up to a neighborhood barbecue where everyone's bragging about their new grills, and then someone rolls in with a full commercial kitchen trailer. It wasn't just bigger, it was an entirely different game. Boat shows thrive on spectacle, but this was on another level. The crowd around the 627 wasn't looking at new upholstery or another clever bait-well design. They were staring like kids in a candy shop, circling the thing as though it might suddenly breathe fire. Everyone had their phones out. Dealers whispered about what this could mean for their high-end builds. Skeptics shook their heads, calling it impractical, but the one thing nobody did was walk past it. And that's the power 7 Marine tapped into. They understood that at the luxury end of boating, logic isn't always the driving force. Emotion is. You don't spend $500,000 on engines because you want a fuel-efficient cruise. You do it because you want to turn heads at the dock, because you want people to stop and stare, because you want to own something nobody else can match. Within hours, the 627 wasn't just an engine, it was the story of the show. Every boat magazine had a feature ready. Every photographer wanted that shot of the transom lined with chrome, paint, and raw horsepower. Even seasoned captains who'd seen it all admitted they hadn't seen anything quite like this. And the buzz didn't stop at the docks. Word rippled through the industry. Yamaha and Mercury engineers, who thought they had years to play it safe, suddenly had a new benchmark looming over them. Boat builders started whispering about redesigns to handle not 2, but 4 or even 6 of these monsters on a transom. In one afternoon, 7 Marine had moved the goalposts. Now, before I tell you the secret behind what powered this monster, make sure to like and subscribe, because I promise you're going to want to know what made the 627 more than just a pretty face. So what was the secret under that massive cowl? 7 Marine had done something nobody else dared. They raided Detroit's muscle car garage. Inside the 627 sat a General Motors LSA 6.2-liter supercharged V8, the same block found in Cadillac's CTS-V and Corvette ZR1. That's right, the same engine you'd find purring under the hood of a luxury sedan or screaming down a drag strip was now bolted to the back of a center console. It was equal parts genius and insanity. Think about it. You could walk into a Cadillac showroom, pop the hood, and see the same heart beating as the monster that was now pushing a 40-foot fishing boat across Biscayne Bay. For boating purists, it was heresy. For everyone else, it was the most exciting thing to happen to outboards in decades. And it wasn't just about the horsepower. Yes, 627 horses was mind-blowing when Mercury and Yamaha were still topping out around 350, but the real magic was torque. Big boats that usually wallowed and groaned before lumbering onto plane now leapt forward like jet skis. One captain described it as waking up in a bulldozer that thinks it's a Ferrari. Acceleration was brutal, addictive, and unlike anything the marine world had ever experienced. But 7 Marine didn't stop there. They gave the 627 features the competition hadn't even thought about. Most outboards relied on raw water cooling, simple but corrosive over time. The 627 used a closed-loop cooling system, just like your car. It meant longer life, fewer saltwater headaches, and cleaner running. For boat owners tired of fighting corrosion, this was practically black magic. Then came the transmission. Traditional outboards are direct drive, throttle up, the prop spins, end of story. 7 Marine added a ZF Marine transmission with joystick control. Suddenly, docking a 40-foot rig didn't feel like arm wrestling a beast. It felt like sliding a Cadillac into a parking spot. You could pivot sideways, spin in place, or crab walk into a slip. For veteran captains, it was a revelation. For nervous first-timers, it was a lifesaver. And let's not forget the style. 7 Marine understood their buyers. Performance mattered, sure, but so did swagger. So they offered custom paint jobs, polished trim, even LED lighting. Your engines didn't have to be anonymous black boxes anymore. They could gleam like candy, glow at night, or match your hull down to the pinstripe. One owner joked that his 7 Marines got more Instagram likes than the boat itself, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. Of course, all of this came at a price, and what a price it was. A single 627 cost north of $100,000, but here's the catch. Nobody bought just one. These engines didn't live on modest skiffs. They lived in triples, quads, even sextuples. That meant $500,000 on engines before you even bought the hull. One dealer summed it up. People aren't buying boats anymore, they're buying horsepower, and the boat just comes attached. It was absurd, it was excessive, and yet it was brilliant. 7 Marine understood that boating at the top end isn't about efficiency or practicality, it's about spectacle. The 627 turned transoms into centerpieces and boat shows into arms races. Fast forward to today, and everyone calls Mercury's 600 V12 revolutionary. Yamaha's XTO 450 gets praised for torque and tech, but 7 Marine, they were already there, years ahead. By now, word of the 7 Marine 627 had spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a new engine, it was a statement. And it made every other outboard at the Miami Boat Show feel like yesterday's news. Competitors like Yamaha and Mercury must have felt like heavyweight boxers suddenly confronted by a scrappy newcomer who could punch twice as hard and laugh while doing it. The boating world had always been a place of incremental improvements. Add a little horsepower here, tweak fuel injection there, maybe release a shinier cowling design, but 7 Marine didn't play by those rules. They showed up like the eccentric uncle at Thanksgiving who drives a Lamborghini to the family barbecue, parking it between 2 pickup trucks. Everyone stared. Nobody quite knew what to say. The truth is, 7 Marine was never trying to compete in the middle. They didn't care about being practical or appealing to the masses. They aimed straight at the top of the pyramid. The luxury sport fishers and giant center consoles that were starting to dominate marinas in Florida, the Bahamas, and the Gulf Coast. These weren't family boats pulling kids on tubes. These were floating showcases for people who thought nothing of spending 6 figures on electronics alone, and 7 Marine knew their audience. If you were dropping $1.5 million on a hull, why not add $500,000 in engines that turned heads every time you left the dock? Suddenly, horsepower wasn't just about speed. It was about status. 4 627s on your transom was like parking a Ferrari collection at the marina. It was disruptive, but also a little uncomfortable for the established players. Yamaha had its F350. Mercury had its Verado 350s. Those were once the crown jewels, the bragging rights motors. But when 7 Marine rolled out with nearly double the power, it reset the scoreboard overnight, and the ripple effect went deeper than just horsepower numbers. 7 Marine was redefining what an outboard could be. Before, engines were functional, hidden behind cowls that all looked the same, but 7 Marine treated engines like jewelry. They offered custom paint schemes, polished metals, and lighting packages that made them Instagram famous. Dockside, people didn't gather to look at the boats anymore. They gathered to count the 7s. The company also tapped into something that made seasoned captains grin and rookies breathe easier: joystick control. If you've ever watched someone try to dock a 40-foot boat in a crosswind, you know it can go from comedy to tragedy in seconds. The ZF transmission setup on the 627 turned that chaos into ballet. Captains could crab walk into slips or pirouette in tight quarters with fingertip control. It was the kind of tech usually reserved for big inboard yachts, suddenly available on an outboard rig. But perhaps the most disruptive thing of all was psychological. 7 Marine changed what boaters thought was possible. Before the 627, nobody even imagined an outboard breaking 500 horsepower. It wasn't part of the conversation. The ceiling felt fixed, and then, with one bold move, 7 Marine didn't just raise the ceiling, they blew the roof off. One magazine writer at the time put it perfectly: 7 Marine didn't just launch an engine, they launched a challenge. The giants would respond, of course, but in that moment, in those few years, 7 Marine owned the conversation. They weren't just ahead of the curve, they were the curve. It's one thing to stop traffic at a boat show. It's another thing entirely to prove you belong once the throttles are slammed forward on open water. 7 Marine didn't just shock the docks, they had to back it up offshore, where engines live or die, and to their credit, the 627 did. Owners who strapped triples or quads to the back of big center consoles discovered something surreal. Boats that used to crawl onto planes suddenly jumped. Imagine a 40-foot, 20,000-pound machine leaping forward like it thought it was a jet ski. Old-school captains compared it to a bull finally breaking out of the pen. All that weight suddenly moving with impossible urgency. People used to complain about long, sluggish hole shots on heavy rigs. Not with 7s. Tap the throttles and you went from idle to wide-eyed in seconds. The boats that wore these monsters became legends in their own right. HCB Estrellas, HydraSports Customs, invincible catamarans, rigs that already cost more than most houses. One Florida owner described the sensation of running quad 627s as like being punched in the back by God. Subtle, maybe not, but accurate. Of course, it wasn't just about speed. The joystick docking systems meant you could drive a floating mansion into a tight slip as easily as parallel parking an SUV. For many, that feature alone justified the price tag. Nervous owners who'd avoided bigger boats suddenly dove in because the 7s gave them confidence. A few dealers joked that more marriages were saved by joystick docking than by counseling. But here's the thing about putting a Cadillac heart into a saltwater environment. It came with quirks. Those supercharged LSA blocks loved power, but they also loved fuel. Running 4.7s at wide open throttle meant gallons vanished like drinks at a Vegas pool party. Owners had to plan fuel stops like pilots. Some didn't care, they could afford it, but others quickly learned that the bragging rights came with a very real price at the pump. And maintenance, that was another adventure. These weren't engines you dropped off at the local Yamaha or Mercury shop. 7 Marines were exotic. Parts were specialized, techs were rare, and costs stacked up fast. One South Florida captain quipped, "If you need to ask about service prices, you probably shouldn't be running 7s. Still, for those few who owned them, it didn't matter. You weren't buying a 7 Marine to be sensible. You were buying it to dominate. Every time you idled out of a marina, heads turned. Every time you let them up on plane, people grabbed cameras. In many ways, the 627 wasn't just an engine. It was a performance, and the boat was the stage. But here's the catch. The very excess that made the 627 famous also limited it. Not everyone wanted or needed 627 horsepower on a single block, and the giants, Mercury and Yamaha, were watching closely, ready to close the gap. For all its brilliance, the 7 was about to face its toughest test: survival in a market not built for moonshots. For a few years, 7 Marine lived in its own rarefied air. Nobody else had dared to bolt 627 horsepower to a transom, and it gave them the kind of mystique that made them the darling of every boat show. But in the world of marine engines, sleeping giants don't stay asleep forever. Yamaha was the first to flinch. Their F350, once the undisputed king, suddenly looked like a middleweight standing next to a heavyweight champ. They began tinkering with the idea of bigger, beefier XTO outboards, eventually giving us the 425 and later the 450. Those engines weren't just about power. They brought in more torque, better thrust, and bigger props designed for massive boats. Yamaha wasn't trying to match 7 Marine horsepower for horsepower, but they were making sure no customer walked away thinking their motors weren't up to the task. Then came Mercury, and when Mercury decides to enter a fight, they don't come quietly. Their Verado line had already built a reputation for performance and refinement. But it wasn't until 2021 that Mercury dropped the bombshell, the 600 horsepower V12. Suddenly, 7's bragging rights shrank overnight. Mercury didn't just get close to the 627. They did it with a motor designed for easier maintenance, better fuel efficiency, and a dealer network stretching from Miami to Michigan. That was the dagger, because for all of 7's brilliance, they were still a boutique builder. If you owned a 7 Marine and needed service in the Bahamas or Mexico, you might be waiting for a specialized tech to fly in. If you owned a Mercury, there was a shop in practically every harbor. Big horsepower was one thing, big support was another, and Mercury didn't stop with numbers. They introduced innovations 7 Marine had pioneered: joystick docking, luxury styling, advanced cooling, but delivered them with the full weight of Brunswick's empire behind it. Suddenly, what felt exotic became mainstream. Meanwhile, 7 Marine was dealing with the realities of running a small company in a brutal market. Fuel prices didn't help. Neither did the sheer cost of ownership. At $100,000 per engine, the 7s were Bugattis in a world where most boaters were still buying pickup trucks. The target market was tiny, and Mercury was smart enough to make their 600 V12 more accessible to a larger slice of buyers. The irony is, 7 Marine had forced the giants to act, but once they did, 7's unique edge began to fade. Their innovations became the industry standard, but they no longer had the dealer networks or mass production power to keep up. And that's the bittersweet part of the story. 7 Marine lit the fuse, but Mercury and Yamaha built the fireworks. They brought the spectacle to the masses, leaving 7 Marine struggling to hold its place in the very race it had started. By 2017, 7 Marine had already carved itself into boating lore. The 627 was a head-turning monster, and for a moment, it felt like 7 might just force the industry into a new era of outboards. But behind the glossy cowls and the Instagram buzz, cracks were starting to show. The first issue was cost. At more than $100,000 per engine, the 627 wasn't just expensive, it was outrageous. Owners of big luxury center consoles could swallow that pill, but the market was small. Most boaters simply couldn't justify spending $500,000 on engines alone. One South Florida dealer famously said, "We're not selling boats anymore, we're selling horsepower, and the boat just comes attached." It was funny, but it was also the truth. 7's market was limited to a tiny pool of ultra-wealthy buyers. The second problem was practicality. The Cadillac-derived supercharged V8 block was thrilling, but it was also thirsty. Fuel burn at wide-open throttle was shocking, and even at cruising speeds, the 7's guzzled gas compared to competitors. Add in the fact that maintenance required specialized technicians and proprietary parts, and many owners found the engines more exotic than convenient. They were impressive showpieces, but they didn't always fit into the messy, real-world lives of boaters. Enter Volvo Penta. In 2017, the Swedish marine giant announced it had acquired 7 Marine. To many, it felt like salvation. Volvo had deep pockets, a global dealer network, and the resources to refine 7's ideas into something more sustainable. For a time, optimism ran high. People imagined 7's radical concepts, powered by Volvo's engineering and infrastructure, finally breaking into the mainstream. But reality played out differently. Volvo tried to integrate 7's engines into its portfolio, even rebranding them as part of its high-performance marine division. Yet, the very things that made 7 unique, boutique exclusivity, radical horsepower, custom styling, clashed with Volvo's reputation for sensible Scandinavian efficiency. A 7 Marine 627 wasn't a sensible engine by any measure. It was an over-the-top spectacle, a statement piece, and that didn't quite fit with Volvo's DNA. Meanwhile, the competition had caught up. Mercury 600 V12 offered nearly as much power, but with better dealer support, smoother integration, and easier servicing. Yamaha's XTO offshore models gave buyers torque, reliability, and a familiar badge they trusted. 7 Marine's claim to being ahead of the curve had been true, but it was also fleeting. By 2021, Volvo quietly pulled the plug. 7 Marine engines would no longer be produced, ending one of the most audacious experiments in marine engineering. The news didn't shock the industry. Most had seen it coming, but it was bittersweet. 7 Marine had proven what was possible, but in doing so, they paved the way for bigger players to swoop in and take the market. In the end, 7 Marine was too far ahead of its time, too ambitious for its size, and too expensive for the world it lived in. But its short, fiery existence left an imprint no one in the boating world will forget. 7 Marine may be gone, but its roar still echoes across every dock lined with mega outboards. They proved excess could shape the future. If you loved this deep dive into boating's wildest chapter, hit like, subscribe, and stick around. The next story will blow your mind.